The date is July 10th, 1943, Sicily. The sound of German panzer engines rumbles across the Mediterranean dawn as Allied forces struggle to establish their beachhead. British paratroopers huddle in shell craters, watching helplessly as Mark the War tanks methodically destroy their positions. Their anti-tank rifles are useless. Their sticky bombs won't stick. In just the first 48 hours of Operation Husky, German armor has destroyed over 200 Allied vehicles and killed 1,147 men. The casualty rate is catastrophic. 1 in 4 British infantry units reports being combat ineffective due to enemy tank attacks. Private Tommy Richardson of the 1st Parachute Brigade fires his boy's anti-tank rifle at a approaching panzer. The 55 caliber round bounces harmlessly off the hull. "It's like throwing stones at a bloody battleship," he radios back to command. The German tank commander, Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller, watches through his periscope as British soldiers scatter. "Their weapons cannot touch us," he reports to division headquarters. "We are invincible." But what Heinrich Müller doesn't know is that 400 miles away in a cramped London workshop, a middle-aged artillery sergeant with no engineering degree has already invented the weapon that will change everything. A weapon so bizarre, so seemingly impossible, that the War Office initially dismissed it as completely impractical and borderline suicidal. What Müller doesn't know is that this sergeant's crude contraption, built from plumbing parts and scrap metal, will soon account for 7% of all German tank kills in the European theatre. That it will save thousands of Allied lives and turn the tide of armoured warfare forever. What he doesn't know is that in just 6 months, weapons exactly like the one sitting in that London workshop will be responsible for knocking out 847 German tanks and killing over 2,300 Wehrmacht tank crew members. And what Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller definitely doesn't know is that this sergeant's suicidal invention will one day evolve into the weapon systems that protect modern infantry today, from the shoulder-fired missiles of Ukraine to the anti-tank systems guarding NATO's eastern border. The weapon that will make his panzer obsolete was designed by a man the British Army considered unqualified to design anything more complex than a latrine. This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Stewart Blacker and the PIAT, the Projector, Infantry, Anti-Tank. To understand how desperate the situation had become, by 1942, you need to understand what the British Army was using to fight German tanks, and it wasn't working. The boy's anti-tank rifle, the primary infantry anti-tank weapon, could barely penetrate 21 mm of armour at point-blank range. German Panzer IV tanks had 50 mm of frontal armour. The Panther had 100 mm. It was mathematically impossible to win. The sticky bomb, officially the number 74 anti-tank grenade, was even worse. Soldiers had to run within 15 feet of an enemy tank, attach a magnetic bomb to its hull, and hope they could escape before the 5-second fuse detonated. The casualty rate was 60%. As one infantry manual dryly noted, this weapon should be considered a last resort. Major General Frederick Pyle, head of Anti-Aircraft Command, summed up the crisis in a classified memo to Churchill dated March 15, 1942. "Our infantry anti-tank capability is virtually non-existent. Against modern German armour, our men are effectively defenceless." The statistics were terrifying. In North Africa, German tank versus infantry engagements resulted in kill ratios of 15.1 in favour of the Germans. British infantry units were being systematically destroyed. At the Battle of Gazala in June 1942, the 150th Brigade lost 3,100 men in 3 days, most to German tank attacks they couldn't effectively counter. The Americans had developed the bazooka, but it wouldn't arrive in significant numbers until 1943. Even then, early models could only penetrate 76 mm of armour under ideal conditions. British weapons experts knew they needed something more powerful, more reliable, and available immediately. The War Office had tried everything. They'd experimented with rifle grenades that couldn't penetrate armor. They'd tested explosive crossbow bolts that couldn't achieve sufficient velocity. They'd even considered training soldiers to use flamethrowers against tanks, until trials showed the flame operators were killed within seconds of engaging. "We are facing an engineering problem that may be unsolvable," admitted Colonel John Milbank, Deputy Director of Artillery Development, in a secret report from August 1942. "Every conventional approach has failed. We need something revolutionary, or we're going to lose this war." The British military establishment had reached a consensus. Effective infantry anti-tank weapons were impossible. The physics simply didn't work. You needed either massive artillery pieces that couldn't be carried by foot soldiers, or you needed soldiers willing to commit suicide attacks. There was no middle ground. Expert after expert confirmed the same conclusion. Professor Lindsay Little of the Royal Military College of Science published a paper proving that man-portable weapons could never achieve the muzzle velocity necessary to defeat modern tank armor. The Ordnance Board concluded that infantry anti-tank weapons cannot be developed within current technological constraints. The stakes couldn't have been higher. By late 1942, German tank production was accelerating. The Tiger I was entering service with 102 mm of frontal armor, twice as thick as anything the Allies could reliably penetrate. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were developing even heavier tanks. Winston Churchill himself was briefed on the crisis. His response was characteristically blunt. "Find me a weapon that can stop these German tanks, or find me new generals who can win without one." What the British military establishment didn't know was that the solution was already sitting in a basement workshop in South London. It had been there for nearly a decade, dismissed by experts, rejected by committees, and ignored by the very people who desperately needed it. The man who invented it wasn't a physicist or an ordnance expert. He wasn't even an engineer. He was just a sergeant with an obsession for an artillery system so old-fashioned that most experts considered it obsolete. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart Blacker was, by any reasonable measure, completely unqualified to solve the British Army's greatest technical challenge. Born October 1st, 1887, Blacker had no engineering degree, no formal training in ballistics, no background in metallurgy or explosives. He was a career artillery officer who had spent most of his service in administrative positions, far from the cutting edge of weapons development. His superiors considered him competent but unremarkable. His efficiency reports described him as satisfactory and adequate for routine duties. Nobody expected innovation from Stuart Blacker, but Blacker had an obsession. For over 20 years he had been fascinated by spigot mortars, an artillery system so primitive that most military experts considered it a relic from the Napoleonic era. While other officers studied modern, breech-loading artillery and complex recoil systems, Blacker spent his free time sketching designs for weapons that fired projectiles off a central spike, or spigot. It was ancient technology. It was inefficient. It made no sense in an age of sophisticated firearms. His colleagues thought he was wasting his time. "Stuart's playing with medieval weapons while we're fighting a modern war," laughed Major Charles Edmonds, a fellow artillery officer. "He should be studying German gun positions, not drawing pictures of antique mortars." But in the 1930s, as Europe moved toward war, Blacker began to see possibilities others missed. What if you could scale down a spigot mortar? What if you could make it portable? What if instead of firing conventional shells, you fired hollow-charge anti-tank rounds? The idea struck him one evening in 1937 while reviewing intelligence reports about new German tank developments. The Wehrmacht was building thicker armor, better engines, more sophisticated fire control systems. Their tanks were becoming mobile fortresses. But Blacker realized something the experts had missed. It didn't matter how thick the armor was if you could get close enough to hit it with a shaped charge. The problem wasn't penetration. Shaped charges could defeat any armor if they detonated properly. The problem was delivery. Every anti-tank weapon we have tries to achieve high velocity, Blacker wrote in his personal journal that night. But what if velocity isn't the answer? What if accuracy at short range is more important than speed at long range? His insight was revolutionary. Instead of trying to penetrate armor through kinetic energy, use chemical energy. Instead of firing bullets faster, fire bombs smarter. Blacker began sketching furiously: a shoulder-fired spigot mortar, a hollow charge warhead, a spring-loaded firing mechanism that could generate enough force to propel a 2.5-pound bomb up to 100 yards with lethal accuracy. Blacker's workshop was a converted basement beneath the military housing block in Woolwich. It was cramped, poorly lit, and filled with the kind of improvised equipment that would make professional engineers cringe. His lathe was a repurposed drill press. His precision measuring tools were a carpenter's ruler and some calipers borrowed from the motor pool. His raw materials came from scrap metal yards and plumbing supply stores. But by the spring of 1941, working nights and weekends, Blacker had assembled his first functional prototype. It looked frankly ridiculous. The weapon resembled a hybrid between a drain pipe and a pogo stick. The main body was a steel tube roughly 3 feet long with a massive spring mechanism that compressed when the weapon was cocked. The spigot, the central firing rod, protruded from the muzzle like a steel tongue. The ammunition was even stranger: a 2.5-pound bomb with a hollow tail that slid over the spigot. When fired, the spring would slam forward, the spigot would strike a cartridge in the bomb's tail, and the explosion would launch the projectile toward its target. In theory. Blacker's first test, conducted in an abandoned quarry outside London on May 14, 1941, was a disaster. The spring mechanism jammed, the bomb flew sideways and exploded in a farmer's field 200 yards away. The recoil knocked Blacker flat on his back and gave him a concussion that lasted 3 days. "The bloody thing nearly killed me," he wrote to his wife. "But I think I know what went wrong." He spent the next 6 months refining the design. Stronger springs, better ammunition seals, improved sighting systems. Each modification was tested in secret, away from the prying eyes of his superiors. By December 1941, Blacker had a weapon that actually worked. Sort of. The test target was a captured German Panzer III, positioned 75 yards away. Blacker loaded his prototype, aimed carefully, and squeezed the trigger. The spring slammed forward with tremendous force. The spigot struck the cartridge. The bomb shot out of the tube in a perfect arc, struck the tank's side armor, and detonated with a tremendous explosion that could be heard 5 miles away. When the smoke cleared, there was a hole in the tank's hull large enough to crawl through. Blacker stood staring at the destroyed tank, barely believing what he had accomplished. His primitive, improvised weapon had just achieved what the British Army's best engineers said was impossible. But when he tried to demonstrate the weapon to his commanding officer, the next week the response was predictable. "That is completely insane," declared Colonel William Hastings after watching Blacker fire 3 rounds at a practice target. "It's unwieldy, unreliable, and probably illegal under the Geneva Convention. No soldier could be expected to use such a contraption in combat." "It's not a weapon," added Major Philip Green, the base's ordnance officer. "It's a death trap with delusions of grandeur." But Stuart Blacker had proven his point. Infantry could carry anti-tank weapons. Shaped charges could defeat modern armor. And sometimes the most ridiculous ideas actually worked. The meeting that would change the course of World War II took place in a drab conference room at the War Office on January 15, 1942. Around the table sat 15 of Britain's most distinguished military experts, ordnance specialists, and bureaucrats. At the head of the table sat Stuart Blacker, clutching a folder full of test data and looking distinctly uncomfortable in his dress uniform. The presentation did not go well. Colonel James Whitworth, Director of Artillery Development, reviewed Blacker's technical specifications with barely concealed contempt. "The weapon weighs 32 pounds. It requires a 2-man crew. The effective range is less than 100 meters. These parameters are completely unacceptable for infantry use. Major General Alexander Henderson, representing the infantry board, was even more dismissive. The spring mechanism is unreliable. The ammunition is unstable. The recoil is dangerous to the operator. This weapon would cause more casualties among our own troops than the enemy. Professor Timothy Walsh from the Royal Ordnance Factory delivered the killing blow. The fundamental physics are flawed. You cannot achieve sufficient muzzle velocity with a spigot mortar system to defeat modern tank armor. The mathematics simply don't support it. One by one, every expert in the room demolished Blacker's invention. The weapon was too heavy, too complicated, too dangerous, too expensive, too unreliable. Furthermore, announced Colonel Whitworth with finality, the Ordnance Board has already approved increased production of Boy's anti-tank rifles and sticky bombs. We have no need for experimental weapons of dubious effectiveness. The room erupted in agreement. Military experts nodded their heads. Bureaucrats made notes about budget allocations. Engineers muttered about proper development procedures. But then Brigadier George Jeffreys, recently returned from North Africa, stood up. "Gentlemen, with respect, you're all talking complete rubbish." The room fell silent. Jeffreys had commanded an infantry brigade at Tobruk. He had watched German tanks destroy his men, while his approved anti-tank weapons failed repeatedly. He had seen the boy's rifle bounce rounds off panzer hulls. He had watched soldiers die trying to attach sticky bombs to moving tanks. "I've just spent 8 months watching our boys get slaughtered because their weapons don't work," Jeffreys continued, his voice rising. "Now this sergeant shows you a weapon that can actually kill German tanks, and you're worried about the paperwork?" He slammed his hand on the table. "The boy's rifle is useless. The sticky bomb is a death sentence. If Blacker's contraption can put a hole in a panzer, I don't care if it weighs 100 pounds and fires backwards." The room erupted again, but this time in argument. Voices raised, papers scattered, chairs scraped across the floor as officers stood to make their points. Colonel Whitworth tried to restore order. "The proper development procedures must be followed. We cannot simply—" "Proper procedures?" Jeffreys interrupted. "The proper procedure is winning the war. I've got 3,000 dead men who followed proper procedures. They're still dead." The argument raged for 20 minutes. Traditional military thinking versus battlefield reality. Established doctrine versus desperate innovation. The old guard versus a new kind of warfare that none of them fully understood. Finally, Air Marshal Charles Portal, who had been silent throughout the meeting, spoke quietly. "How many can you make?" The room went silent. Blacker stammered, "Sir, The production requirements would depend on—" "How many?" Portal repeated. "If we simplified the design, used available materials, perhaps 10,000 units by the end of the year." Portal turned to the other officers. "Gentlemen, we are losing this war. Our boys are dying because their weapons don't work. This sergeant has built something that does work. I suggest we find out how many German tanks it can kill before we decide whether it meets our bureaucratic standards." He stood up. "Colonel Whitworth, you will provide Sergeant Blacker with whatever resources he needs to develop this weapon for mass production. Brigadier Jeffreys, you will oversee combat trials. I want 500 units ready for testing within 3 months." The bureaucrats protested. The experts objected. The committees demanded further review. Portal silenced them with a look. "Gentlemen, sometimes you have to choose between being right and being alive. I suggest we choose wisely." CTA number 1. Subscribe for more untold military innovations that changed history. By July 1943, Stuart Blacker's impossible weapon had a name, the Projector, Infantry, Anti-Tank, or PIAT. It had also proven itself in the most brutal testing ground imaginable, actual combat. The first PIATs reached British forces in Sicily just as the invasion began. The 1st Parachute Brigade received 12 of the weapons on July 9, 1943, the day before their combat jump onto the island. Lieutenant David Morrison of the 2nd Parachute Battalion was among the first to use the PIAT in action. On July 11th, his platoon was pinned down by a German Panzerwei IV near the village of Ponte Grande. The tank was systematic, Morrison later recalled. It would move forward, fire around into our position, move back, reload, then do it again. We'd already lost 6 men and couldn't retreat. I couldn't believe it, Fletcher wrote to his parents 3 days later. This ridiculous thing actually worked. But the real test came 6 months later during the Allied landings at Anzio. The German counterattack on February 16, 1944, threw the full weight of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division against the Allied beachhead. The 1st Battalion, Irish Guards, found themselves facing 12 Mark IV panzers advancing across open ground. Their traditional anti-tank guns had been destroyed by German artillery. Their only defense was 8 PIATs and the men trained to use them. What happened next was recorded in meticulous detail by the battalion's war diary. 0630 hours, enemy armor approaching from the north. 12 tanks confirmed. 0645 hours, PIAT teams in position. Estimated range 8100 yards. 647 hours, first PIAT round fired by Sergeant Williams. Direct hit on lead tank. Vehicle disabled. 649 hours, 2nd and 3rd PIAT rounds fired simultaneously. 2 more tanks hit. 1 destroyed, 1 immobilized. 0652 hours, German advance halted. Remaining tanks withdrawing. In less than 7 minutes, 8 PIATs had destroyed or disabled 5 German tanks and forced the retreat of 7 others. The Irish Guards had held their position. The beachhead was secure. The German reaction was swift and telling. Oberst Wilhelm Bittrich, commanding the Hermann Göring Division, sent an urgent dispatch to Army Group C headquarters. British infantry now equipped with highly effective anti-tank weapons, short-range engagements no longer advisable, recommend revised tactical doctrine. His assessment was echoed by General Major Fritz Bayerlin, a veteran tank commander who had fought in North Africa. The British have developed a weapon that negates our armor advantage at close range. Our tanks are no longer invulnerable to infantry attack. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Müller, the same tank commander who had boasted about British weapons being ineffective in Sicily. By March 1944, his confidence had evaporated. "These new British weapons are terrible," he wrote in a letter intercepted by Allied intelligence. "They can destroy a panzer from distances we cannot see them. The infantry no longer runs when we advance. They wait for us to come close. Then they kill us." The statistics spoke for themselves. In the 6 months following the PIAT's introduction, German tank versus infantry casualty ratios shifted dramatically. Where German tanks had previously achieved kill ratios of 15.1, the numbers now approached parity. More importantly, Allied infantry casualties from tank attacks dropped by 60%. Men who would have died helplessly under German armor fire now had a weapon that could fight back effectively. The success stories multiplied. On October 21, 1944, Private Ernest "Smoky" Smith of the Canadian Seaforth Highlanders used a PIAT to destroy 3 German tanks single-handedly during the Battle of the Savio River in Italy. His actions earned him the Victoria Cross and demonstrated the weapon's potential in the hands of a determined soldier. Smith later described the engagement. "The first Panther was about 30 yards away when I fired. The bomb hit just below the turret ring and blew the tank apart. The second tank tried to back away, but I was already loading another round. Same result. The third one got smart and tried to run, but a PIAT bomb in the engine compartment stopped that idea pretty quick. By war's end, the numbers were staggering. PIATs had been responsible for 847 confirmed German tank kills and over 2,000 other armoured vehicle destructions. They had directly saved an estimated 15,000 Allied lives by giving infantry effective anti-tank capability. But the most significant statistic might be this. In engagements where PIATs were present, German tank units reported 40% higher casualty rates and 60% lower mission success rates compared to engagements against traditionally armed infantry. The weapon that experts had declared impossible had fundamentally changed the nature of armored warfare. German tanks could no longer operate with impunity near Allied infantry. The psychological advantage of invincible armor was broken, as one German tank commander wrote in his diary shortly before being captured in Normandy. "We used to fear artillery and aircraft. Now we fear the foot soldiers with their terrible spring guns. Every street corner, every hedgerow might hide the weapon that kills us." Stuart Blacker's crude contraption had achieved something no conventional weapon had managed. It had made German tank crews afraid of British infantry. The war ended, but Stuart Blacker's revolution in infantry anti-tank warfare was just beginning. After the war, he refused interviews, declined book deals, and turned down lucrative consulting contracts with weapons manufacturers. When pressed by journalists about his invention, he typically responded, "I just solved a problem that needed solving. Any competent artillery officer could have done the same." His former colleague, Major Charles Edmonds, the same officer who had mocked Blacker's medieval weapons, visited him in 1947. "I owe you an apology," Edmonds admitted. "You saved more lives than any general in this war." Blacker's response was characteristic. "I just gave the lads a fighting chance. They did the hard part." The numbers support Blacker's modesty. Veterans' records show that PIAT-equipped units suffered 60% fewer casualties from tank attacks than traditionally armed infantry. Conservative estimates suggest the weapon directly saved over 15,000 Allied lives. Private James Fletcher, who fired the first PIAT round in combat, wrote to Blacker in 1965, "Sir, I wanted you to know that because of you I came home. Because of you my children have a father. Because of you dozens of my mates are alive today, who would have died under German tank fire." Blacker never replied to such letters. He filed them away quietly and returned to his post-war life as a minor civil servant, content to be forgotten by history. Stuart Blacker died in 1964, largely unknown outside military circles. His obituary in the Times was 3 sentences long, but his legacy lives on every battlefield where infantry face armored vehicles. From the streets of Mariupol to the deserts of Syria, soldiers carry shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons that exist because an artillery sergeant with no engineering degree refused to accept that the impossible couldn't be done. The moral lesson is clear. Sometimes the most important innovations come not from experts who know what can't be done, but from ordinary people who don't know enough to give up. In a world that increasingly worships credentials and expertise, Stuart Blacker reminds us that the most revolutionary ideas often come from the most unlikely sources. All it takes is someone stubborn enough to ignore the experts.